A police officer attacked a soldier in public. What happened next shocked everyone. The first lie I was ever asked to tell fitted on a single line. I remember the shape of it more clearly than I remember my own hands. A statement form, the standard buff-colored one the Aldenmere City Constabulary used in those days, with the little printed box at the top for the time and the date, and the long ruled field below it where an officer was expected to set down the truth in her own words. The pen was mine. The desk was in the sergeant's room on the second floor of Wellgate Station. The window behind me was open because it was the 11th of the month and unseasonably warm, and I could hear the crowd noise still washing up from the street 4 stories down, that low seashell roar a city makes when a great many people have seen something they cannot yet explain to each other. Sergeant Delvin Crowe stood at my shoulder with his knuckles on the desk, and he told me what to write. "The soldier struck first," he said. "You saw it, put it down." I was 19 weeks into a 2-year probation. I was 23 years old. I had wanted to wear that uniform since I was 11, and I had polished the buttons of it the night before I first put it on, sitting on the edge of my bed like a fool, breathing on the brass. I want to be honest about this, because everything that follows depends on how much I believed. I believed that the uniform made a person better, not braver, better. That there was some virtue soaked into the cloth that would seep into you if you wore it long enough and kept it clean. And there was a man standing in the cells beneath that room, in a red tunic with his collar torn open and his lips swelling, who had not lifted a hand to defend himself for 71 seconds, and Sergeant Crowe wanted me to write that he had struck first. I want to tell you I refused at once. I did not. I sat there with the pen a half-inch above the paper for what felt like a very long time, and the ink gathered at the nib and hung there, and I understood, with a clarity that has never once left me in all the years since, that whichever way that drop of ink fell, it would fall on the rest of my life. That is where the story ends up. Let me take you back to where it started, which was 40 minutes earlier at an archway in a wall, where a man was standing perfectly still. His name was Wystan Hale, Lance Corporal, King's Own Household Guards, 2nd Company. I did not know his name then. Nobody in that street knew his name. That is rather the point of him. You have seen the post, even if you have never seen it. The Palace of Aldenmere shows the city a long pale wall of dressed stone, and at the eastern end of that wall, where the public road bends and the tourist coaches disgorge, there is an arched pedestrian gate called the Wellgate. It is not the ceremonial gate. The ceremonial gate is the grand one, with the gilded iron and the lion-headed bosses and the 8-man guard in the forecourt behind, and that is where the cameras go. The Wellgate is the working gate. It is where the deliveries come, and the household staff, and the horses when they are moved to the mews, and it is guarded by one man at a time. One man in a red wool tunic and a bearskin, with a rifle at his shoulder, standing on a strip of worn flagstone about 11 paces long, with a low chain rail on either side of it that is meant to keep the public back, and does so approximately as well as a good intention. Hale stood the Wellgate that autumn. I had watched him for 3 days before any of it happened, because Sergeant Crowe's cordon detail had been posted on that same corner in the run-up to the Homecoming Procession, and standing about on a corner leaves you a great deal of time to watch things. Here is what I noticed. He came to attention on the hour. He shouldered arms, he stepped off. He marched his 11 paces east with the sound of iron on stone. He turned about, he marched back, he halted, he came to the order, and he stood. Then he did nothing at all for a length of time I never once caught him shortening, not by a breath. Rain came and went. A coach party crowded in with their phones held up like 100 little mirrors, and a man leaned in so close to his face that I could see the fog of the man's breath on the polished chinstrap. And Hale looked through him at a chimney pot on the far side of the road, and after a while the man got bored, as they always do, and went away. A gull landed on the chain rail. A dog barked itself hoarse at him. A small boy dropped an ice cream on his boot and was hauled off crimson-faced by an apologizing mother. And I watched Hale's eyes go down for half a second, and something moved in his face that was very nearly kindness, and then it was gone, and he was stone again. I remember saying to Crowe, on the first of those days, that I did not know how a man could do it. "Do what?" he said. "Stand like that." Crowe laughed. He had a good laugh. That was the trouble with him, an easy, broad, barracks laugh that made you want to be included in it. "That's not standing, girl. That's posing. There's a difference." He tipped his head at Hale, at the whole long wall, at the coaches. "They get the parades. They get the postcards. We get the drunks at 2 in the morning and the sick on the pavement and the mothers screaming in the doorway, and nobody ever bought a fridge magnet with my face on it." He hitched his belt. "He's a doorstop in a fur hat. Don't romanticize him." I laughed too. I want that written down because I have never been able to write it out of myself. I laughed too. Delvin Crowe was 41 years old and he had 14 years in. He was not a fool and he was not a coward, and I have thought about that a great deal, because it would be easier if he had been either. He had gone through a burning stairwell in the Carroll Street fire and brought 2 people down it, and there was a commendation on his record for it, and I had heard him talk a man off a bridge parapet in a voice so gentle it made my chest ache. He was also the son of Chief Superintendent Corporal Crowe, and there is no polite way to say what that did to him. It had made him certain, not confident, certain that whatever he did was policing, because he was a Crowe and Crows were police, and if a thing was done by a Crow in uniform, then the thing was, by definition, correct. I have met that certainty in other men since. It is the most dangerous substance I know. And Sergeant Crowe had a problem with the Wellgate. It was, on its face, a small and stupid problem. The homecoming procession was 3 days out. The king was returning to the capital by road for the first time since the spring, and the route came up the long boulevard, along the palace wall, and in through the ceremonial gate. Crowe had been given the cordon on the eastern stretch, 180 meters of barrier, 11 officers, 6,000 expected spectators. His barrier line had to run along the foot of the wall. And in the middle of his barrier line, occupying 11 paces of it and refusing to be planned around, was the Wellgate sentry. He wanted the sentry gone, or rather he wanted the sentry moved back inside the arch, behind the ironwork, out of his cordon for 4 hours on the day. He said it was a public safety matter. It might even have been one. Crowds compress against a wall, and a man marching a beat inside a compressed crowd is a pinch point, and I have since come to think that if he had raised it properly, in writing, 6 weeks earlier, some staff officer would have signed something and it would have been done, and no one would ever have heard of any of us. He did not raise it properly. He went and told the sentry. I was 3 steps behind him when he did it, on the Wednesday, at about 4 in the afternoon, with the light going tawny along the wall. He walked up to the chain rail and he waited for Hale to complete his beat. I will give him that, he waited, and when Hale halted and came to the order, Crowe leaned over the chain and said, quite pleasantly, "Afternoon. Sergeant Crowe, City Constabulary. Friday I need you back inside the gate, behind the ironwork, 4 hours, 10 till 2, that's the cordon plan." Hale stood. Crowe waited. The tourists nearest us stopped, the way people do when they sense a change of weather. "Did you hear me?" Hale stood. His eyes were on the chimney pot. His white gloves were still. The rifle butt sat on the flagstone by his boot as though it had grown there. I want to be exact about what happened in Crowe's face because I was watching it and I have gone over it in my head perhaps 10,000 times. He was not angry, not yet. He was confused. He had spoken in uniform to a man in a uniform, and the man had not answered, and his whole framework had no slot for that. So he did what men like him do when the framework fails. He got louder. "I'm talking to you, soldier." "Nothing. Look at me when I'm talking to you." A woman in the coach party said, "Oh, they're not allowed to talk, they can't talk," in the delighted, helpful voice of someone repeating a fact they have just learned themselves, and 2 or 3 phones came up. That was the moment. I saw it land. The phones came up, and Sergeant Delvin Crowe of the City Constabulary, who had carried 2 people down a burning stairwell, realized that he was being watched by strangers, being ignored by a doorstop in a fur hat. He put his hand on the chain rail. "Right," he said, "right," and he stepped over it. You have to understand what that is. The chain is nothing. It is a rope of iron links 1.5 feet off the ground, and a determined toddler could get over it. It is not a barrier. It is a sentence. It says, "Beyond this line, a man is on duty for the crown, and you are not to trouble him." Crowe crossed it and walked up to Hale until he was close enough to smell the boot polish, and he put his face 6 inches from the chin strap, and he said, "Friday, 10 o'clock. You will be behind that gate. Do you understand me?" Hale did not blink. Here is what a household guard sentry may lawfully do, and I learned all of this afterward slowly in a courtroom, from a color sergeant with a voice like a closing door. He may march his beat. He may come to attention. He may, if the public press too close, take up the position of port arms, and if that fails, he may, in a voice trained to carry across a parade square, issue a formal challenge and step out. He may, in extremity, detain a person on crown ground until the police arrive. What he may not do, ever, in any circumstance short of an armed attack on the palace, is leave his post, argue, retaliate, or take an order from a person outside his chain of command. Crowe was outside his chain of command. Crowe could have been the king's own brother, and he would still have been outside his chain of command. There was one man on that earth who could move Wystan Hale off the Wellgate, and he was a captain of the king's own household guard, and he was at that moment 200 meters away in an office, entirely unaware that any of this was happening. So Hale gave him the only answer he was permitted to give. He gave him nothing. Crowe stood there for 11 seconds. I counted them later from the footage. 11 seconds, 6 inches from a man's face, in front of 40 tourists and 3 of his own constables and me, and the man he was shouting at did not move his eyes. Then Crowe smiled, and that was worse than the shouting, and stepped back over the chain, and dusted his palms as though he had put something down, and said, loud enough for the crowd, "Friday. You'll move." And we walked away, and a woman in the coach party said, quite clearly, to nobody, "Well, he came off worse there, didn't he?" And I saw the back of Crowe's neck go the color of the tunic behind us. That evening in the muster room he was funny about it. That is the thing people always miss when they ask me afterwards how it was allowed to happen. It was funny. He did a whole routine, the fur hat, the 1,000-yard stare, the little march, 11 paces and about turn, and he stamped his boots on the muster room floor and stood at a rigid mock attention with his eyes crossed, and 8 officers laughed, and I laughed, and Constable Toole laughed so hard he had to put his tea down. "Toy soldiers," Crowe said. "They dress them up and wind them, and the tourists take pictures, but we're the ones who have to police the street they're standing in." He picked up his tea. "Friday, that thing moves, or Friday I move it." And Constable Merrick, who was 6'4" and did not have an original thought in his head, said, "What if he doesn't?" And Crowe said, "And this is the line. This is the line that 14 months later a Crown advocate read out to a court in a voice you could have hung a coat on," Crowe said. "Then he'll learn what a real uniform can do." Nobody wrote it down. Nobody had to. 6 people remembered it word for word, and in the end 4 of them said so on oath. Thursday it rained. I stood the cordon rehearsal in a wet cape with water running down the back of my collar, and I watched the Wellgate sentry, a different man that day, a lad with a smashed flat nose, Hale being on the night rotation, and I thought about the arithmetic of standing still in the rain for 2 hours in a fur hat that must have weighed the same as a small dog. At about noon, a color sergeant came out through the arch and stood beside the sentry for a moment, and I watched him check the man over the way a farrier checks a hoof. the boots, the belt, the set of the collar, and say something short. And the sentry's face didn't change, but something in the shoulders eased, and he went back inside. That was Andre Marsh, 22 years in the household guard, a face like a thumb and the closest thing Wystan Hale had to a father. I did not know that then. I knew nothing then. I was a girl with a warrant card and a wet collar, quietly pleased to be near something important. Crowe came down the line at 1 o'clock and stopped beside me, and looked at the sentry through the rain for a while. "Ardwick," he said, "you're a bright one. Tell me, what is he for?" "Sorry." "Him, the Tin Man. What is he actually asterisk for? There's a steel gate behind him. There's cameras on the wall. There's an armed response section in the yard beyond it, and there's you and me and 9 others out here. If someone came at that gate with intent, what does he do? Stand there. He is decoration, Ardwick. He is a very expensive hat." I said, and I said it because I wanted him to like me, and I have never been able to unsay it. I said, "Maybe he's a sign, sir, like a lock on a door. It doesn't stop anyone. It just says the door isn't yours." And Crowe looked at me for a second, and I thought I'd been clever, and he said, "That's very nice. You should write that on a card." And he walked off down the line, and I stood in the rain feeling the way you feel when you have said something true to a man who has no use for true things. The rain stopped at 4. The barriers went up along the wall that night, aluminum and steel, section by section, and at midnight the last of them was slotted in and locked. All along that 180 meters they made a clean, unbroken run, exactly as the plan required. Except at the well gate where they stopped, and left a gap 11 paces long, because a man had to be able to march. Friday came up clear and cold and gold, the kind of morning the kingdom of Aldenmere puts on for itself when it wants to be photographed. By 8 the boulevard was already 3 deep behind the barriers. By 9 it was 7 deep, and the noise of it was a physical thing, a warm pressure against the wall, and children were up on shoulders and flags were going out along the rails, and somebody's radio was playing the old regimental march badly. The homecoming procession would come up the boulevard at 11:30, the king in the state landau, the crown prince mounted behind, the household guard on foot in 2 files, the whole gleaming apparatus of a kingdom telling itself a story about itself. It is a good story. I have policed it many times since, and I still get something in my throat when the drums come round the bend. At 2 minutes past 10, Lance Corporal Wystan Hale came out through the Wellgate arch, marched to the center of his flagstones, and halted. There was a cheer. Small but real. 100 people at that end of the barrier saw the red coat come out of the dark of the arch into the sunlight, and they cheered him, and phones went up, and a man near me said to his son, "There, look, there he is." And Hale came to the order and stood, and did not so much as move his eyes to the noise. I was posted 6 meters to his left at the eastern end of the gap, with a barrier section at my hip. Constable Merrick had the western end. Sergeant Crowe had the whole stretch and a radio and a clipboard, and at 4 minutes past 10 he came down the line to me and looked at the sentry and said, "He's still there." "Yes, Sergeant. He's still there." He said it a second time quietly to himself, the way a man reads a bill he can't believe. "Sergeant, should we—" I stopped, because I had been about to say should we ring the palace asterisk, and I had suddenly understood from the set of his jaw that ringing the palace was the one thing in the world that would not be happening. To ring the palace would be to admit that the palace was where the answer lived. It would be to admit that the doorstop in the fur hat outranked him, not in years, not in rank, but in the only currency that mattered, which was whose word moves that man. "Should we what?" "Nothing, Sergeant." He tapped his clipboard twice against his thigh. Then he said, "Merrick, the barrier's here. Pull them back a meter." I did not understand it at the time. I understood it about 40 minutes later, and I have never stopped understanding it since. There were 2 barrier sections at the ends of the gap, angled in to funnel the crowd away from the sentry's beat, so that the 11 paces stayed clear. It was not a great deal of protection. It was the only protection there was, and Crowe had Merrick and Toole drag both sections back a meter and turn them, so that instead of funneling the crowd away from the flagstones, they funneled the crowd asterisk toward them. He didn't touch Hale, he never touched him then, he simply took away the walls. And the crowd, which was not malicious, which was 6,000 ordinary people on a bright morning who wanted to see a king, did what a crowd does when a space opens. It flowed in. 10:30, the flagstones had people on them. Not many at first, a family with a pushchair, 2 young men with a flag, a woman with a camera on a strap. They stood on the sentry's beat because it was a good spot with a clear view up the boulevard, and there was no barrier telling them not to, and there was one man standing there in a red coat who wasn't saying anything. Hale came to attention, shouldered arms stepped off. And a soldier's beat is not a suggestion. It is 11 paces at a fixed cadence, and it does not go around things, because the moment it goes around things it stops being a beat and becomes a walk, and a walk can be edged, crowded, herded, and finally stopped, and a sentry who can be stopped is not a sentry. So he marched, and the 2 young men with the flag scrambled out of his way laughing, and the woman with the camera got a marvelous photograph, and the family with the pushchair backed up against the wall, and Hale went 11 paces east, turned about, and came back through the gap that had closed behind him, and the crowd parted and laughed and filmed and closed again. He did it 4 times. By the 5th, there were perhaps 30 people on his beat. They were pressed in on both sides and behind, and the phones were a wall of glass, and I could see the flagstones vanishing, and I got on my radio. "Sergeant, the sentry's beat is being crowded. Requesting we reset the barriers." The radio said, "Negative. Sergeant, he can't." "Ardwick," the voice was calm and warm, and I can hear it now. "The crowd goes where the crowd goes. We're not a nanny service. If he has a problem with the public, he can take it up with the public." I stood there with my thumb on the transmit key, and I did not press it again. That is a thing I will carry. At 22:11, Hale halted mid-beat and took up port arms. He brought the rifle across his body, diagonally, both hands on it, and he drove his right boot down on the flagstone with a crack like a dropped plank, and the whole crowd in that gap flinched back a full pace, and for 2 seconds there was space, and silence, and the sentry's face under the bearskin was absolutely without expression. That is the warning. That is the polite one. He was telling them in the only language his orders allowed, back. The crowd, being a crowd, obeyed and then forgot. Within a minute they had flowed forward again, laughing, apologizing, filming, and one of the young men with the flag had begun to imitate the boot stamp, and people were clapping the rhythm of it. And Sergeant Delvin Crowe stood at the western end of the gap with his arms folded, and he watched, and he smiled, and he did not move a barrier. I have been asked, more times than I can count, whether he planned what came next. I do not think he planned any of it. I think he built a room with no doors, walked into it, found himself trapped, and blamed the man standing in it. That is worse than a defense. A man who plans a wrong can be talked out of it. A man who has arranged for the wrong to be inevitable and then calls it asterisk procedure cannot be talked out of anything at all. At 11:06, the crowd on the beat became a problem that even Crowe could not ignore, because a woman went down. She didn't fall far. She was elderly, and she was pushed from behind by the general surge, and she went onto one knee on the flagstone about 3 paces from the sentry's post, and her handbag went one way and her hat went the other. And there was that instant of horrid stillness a crowd makes when something has gone wrong in the middle of it, and nobody can reach the middle. Hale broke. That is the word I used in my statement, and it is the word I will use here, because I want you to feel exactly what it cost him. He broke his post. He came out of the order and took 2 steps forward and put his left hand under that woman's arm and lifted her, the whole weight of her, one-handed, the rifle still on his right shoulder, And he set her on her feet and held her until she had them, and he stooped and picked up her hat, and he gave it to her. I was near enough to hear it. He said, "You're all right, madam." 4 words. The only 4 words I ever heard Wystan Hale say in that street, and every one of them was a disciplinary offense. Then he stepped back, came to attention and stood, and the crowd around him went off like a firework, a great warm roar of it, people cheering and clapping and holding their phones over their heads, and the woman was crying and patting his sleeve and being drawn away by her son, and somebody shouted, "Good lad," and 40 strangers took up the cheer. And Sergeant Crowe came across the flagstones at a walk. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the morning that 11,000 people have now watched, and I was the only person alive standing behind Crowe's right shoulder, which is the one place no camera was. From the front on the footage, you see a police sergeant walk into frame with his face perfectly composed. You see him say something. You see the guardsman fail to respond. You see the sergeant put a hand flat on the guardsman's chest and shove. From behind his right shoulder, I saw something else first. I saw him hear the cheer. 6,000 people on that boulevard, and 100 of them were cheering. And they were not cheering the king, who was still 4 minutes out. And they were not cheering the police, who had been standing in that street since 6 in the morning holding a line so that nobody died. They were cheering a doorstop in a fur hat who had picked up an old woman's hat. He heard it, and I watched his shoulders come up, and he walked out onto the flagstones. He said, "That's it, you're done, get behind the gate." Hale stood, eyes forward, chin strap, chimney pot. "You've just broken your own post to play the hero for the cameras. You are a public safety hazard and I am removing you. Get behind that gate." Hale stood, and Crowe put his hand flat on the red tunic, on the medals, and shoved. He was a big man and he put his weight into it. Hale went back half a pace, one boot scuffing on the flagstone, and then the boot came down and squared, and he was still. He had not moved his hands. He had not moved his eyes. The rifle was still at the order beside his boot. Somebody in the crowd said, "Hey," in the tone of a man who has just seen a thing he cannot believe he has seen, and then the whole gap went strange and quiet in the way a room goes quiet when a glass breaks in another room, and the phones, all of them, every single one, 120 of them, we counted them afterwards from the footage, came up. And Sergeant Delvin Crowe of the Aldenmere City Constabulary, standing in front of 120 cameras, with the King of Aldenmere 4 minutes down the road, did the thing that ended him. He drew his baton. It is a black composite stick about 2 feet long. It is not a weapon of war. It is not intended to be, and there is a whole book of law and training about when a constable may draw one and what he may strike with it. And I could recite most of that book by the age of 25 because I had to. He did not strike him with it, not at first. He used it the way a bad-tempered man uses a stick, which is to say he used it to humiliate. He reached up and knocked the bearskin off Wystan Hale's head. It went sideways and back and hit the flagstones with a soft, absurd, dreadful sound, and rolled a little, and stopped against the base of the wall. And there in the sunlight in front of 6,000 people was a man's actual head, short brown hair, flattened and damp with sweat, a pale forehead with a red line pressed across it from the chin strap, ears that stuck out slightly, a jaw, a young man's face, 29 years old, and I had never once thought of him as having a face until that moment, and neither, I think, had anybody else in that street. He did not look at his bearskin. He did not raise a hand to his head. He came to attention, and I mean he snapped asterisk to it, the boots going together with a crack that carried, and he stood there bareheaded on his flagstones with his eyes on the chimney pot, and he waited to be struck. The crowd made a sound I have never heard a crowd make before or since. It was not a gasp and it was not a boo. It was a sort of long, low, wounded groan, 6,000 people in the one long second before a wrong. And Crowe hit him. 71 seconds. I am going to tell it plainly once, and then I am going to tell you what it was like from inside my own skin, because those are two different things, and the court only ever wanted the first one. The first blow was open-handed, across the face, backhanded, and it turned Hale's head about 15 degrees, and it split his lower lip against his teeth. He brought his head back to the front. He did not touch his mouth. The second was the baton, low, across the outside of the left thigh, the strike they teach you, the one that is supposed to buckle a violent man's leg and put him on the ground so that you can control him without hurting him badly. It is a legitimate strike. It is legitimate against a man who is coming at you. Hale was standing at attention with his arms at his sides and a rifle grounded beside his boot, and the blow took him on the thigh, and his leg shivered under him and did not buckle. He stood. The third was the same, the other leg. The fourth was across the small of the back as Crowe circled him, and it made a sound like a book dropped on a table, and Hale's shoulders went forward perhaps 2 inches and came back. He stood. Somewhere behind me, a woman was screaming at Crowe to stop. Somewhere a man was bellowing at the rest of us, at me, at Merrick, at Toole, do something, your police, do something. And the crowd was pressing forward against nothing, because we had taken away the barriers, and the pressure of them was tipping the front rank onto the flagstones, and Merrick had his arms out and was shouting at people to get back. And I want to be precise. I did not freeze. Freezing is what people say afterwards because it sounds like something that happens to you, like weather. I did not freeze. I made a decision in a fraction of a second, and the decision was, he is my sergeant. 19 weeks, that is all it takes. The fifth blow was to the ribs. The sixth was the flat of the baton across the back of the shoulders. Between the sixth and the seventh, Crowe stopped and came round the front and stood in Hale's eyeline, breathing hard, and said something. The audio on the nearest phone catches it. It has been played in a courtroom and in a chamber of parliament and in 100,000 houses. Crowe said, "Say something, say one word, move." And Wystan Hale, bareheaded, with his mouth bleeding, standing at attention on 11 paces of flagstone he was ordered to hold, looked through him at a chimney pot and gave him nothing. The 7th, 8th, and 9th blows came fast, and they were not police strikes anymore. They were a man beating something that would not break. And on the 9th, the baton came down across the back of Hale's right hand where it lay flat against his thigh, and the white glove split, and his hand jumped and closed and opened again and went flat against his thigh. That is the frame they used on every front page in the kingdom, the split white glove, the hand going flat again. Then Crowe stopped, because he was out of breath, and because the noise of 6,000 people had finally reached him. 71 seconds, 9 blows. And the man he was hitting had not lifted a hand, had not spoken, had not moved his eyes, and this is the part that broke something open in the whole country when they saw it, had not, at any point, stepped off his 11 paces of stone. Everybody asks about the rifle. He could have used it, not as people imagine, not as a firearm. There is a whole other book about that, and none of it applied. But a rifle is 1.5 meters of walnut and steel, and Wystan Hale was 29, 6 years in the household guard and 4 before that in a line regiment, in the condition of a man who runs 10 miles before breakfast. Delvin Crowe was 41 and carried it round the middle. If Hale had wanted to put him on the flagstones, it would have taken under 2 seconds. They asked him about that at the trial for 40 minutes because it was the only door the defense had. I was in the gallery. I will come to it. What ended it was not the police. I want that on the record because in the years since, a story has grown up in which the constabulary intervened, and it is not true, and I have corrected it in every room I have ever been asked to stand up in. What ended it was the household guard. The Wellgate Arch is a dark tunnel of stone about 10 meters deep, and out of it, at a pace I can only describe as unhurried, came Color Sergeant Andre Marsh in shirt sleeves without a hat, with a mug of tea still in his left hand. He did not run. To this day I do not know how a man walks that slowly toward that. He crossed the flagstones and he put himself between Sergeant Crowe and Lance Corporal Hale, his back to Crowe, facing Hale, and he looked at Hale for about 2 seconds. Then he turned round. I have policed for 19 years. I have stood in front of men with knives. I have never in my life seen a man look at another man the way Andre Marsh looked at Delvin Crowe. There was no violence in it at all. That was what was so awful about it. It was the look you give a thing that has been left out in the rain and ruined. He said, "Put that down." Crowe said, "Get out of my." "Put it down." And Crowe put the baton down. Not on the ground. He lowered it to his side. But he put it down, and everybody in that street saw him do it, and 11,000 people have now watched him do it. Marsh said, "That man is a sentry of the king's own household guard on crown ground at his post. You have assaulted him 9 times in front of 6,000 witnesses, and I have counted everyone. Now you will step back off this ground, and you will stand where I can see you, and you will wait for your inspector." And then Marsh turned his back on him, turned his asterisk back on him, which was the most contemptuous thing I have ever seen one man do to another, and walked to the base of the wall and picked up the bearskin, and brushed the dust off it with his forearm, twice, carefully, the way you would brush a hat you were going to wear to a wedding. He brought it back and stood in front of Hale. "Lance Corporal." Hale's eyes came off the chimney pot for the first time in 71 seconds, and found his color sergeant's face. "You're relieved," Marsh said. "You've held it, now let go." And Wystan Hale, I do not know how to write this and have it land the way it landed on that street. Wystan Hale shook his head. Marsh's jaw moved. "Say again." And Hale said quietly, in a voice like a man asking for a glass of water, "There's nobody on the gate, Color Sergeant." Marsh stood there with the bearskin in his 2 hands, and then he said, "There is now," and he lifted it, and set it on Hale's head with both hands and straightened it, and buckled the strap under the chin and stepped back, and came to attention himself in shirt sleeves with tea on his boots and saluted him. The crowd went up like a stadium. And that would have been the end of it, a bad, ugly, filthy morning, a sergeant finished, a soldier bruised, a story for a week, except that Delvin Crowe was a crow and certain, and standing in the wreck of his own life with 6,000 people howling at him, and men like that do not stop. He did the only thing left that could make it worse. He arrested Wystan Hale. Assault on a police officer, obstruction, effray. He said it loudly. He said it in the voice they teach you, the flat carrying voice for a public arrest, and he had his cuffs out before he had finished saying it, and he came in behind Hale and took the right wrist, the one with the split glove, and twisted it up. Marsh moved. 2 guardsmen came out of the arch at a dead run. And Wystan Hale said, without turning his head, in a voice that stopped all 3 of them in their tracks, "Color Sergeant, stand fast." Marsh stopped as though he had hit glass. "Wystan, stand fast." And then more quietly, "If we put hands on him, they'll say it was a brawl, let him do it." And he put his other hand behind his back himself, and held it there, and let a police sergeant put steel on him on crown ground in front of the king's own wall, 4 minutes before the king came round the bend. They took his rifle off him. They took it out of his hands, and Constable Toole, who did not know what to do with it, held it across his body like a man holding a bag of shopping, and Color Sergeant Andre Marsh crossed the flagstones and took it from him without a word, and stood with it grounded beside his own boot, in shirt sleeves, on the empty post. And Marsh stayed there. That is a thing I did not learn until much later. Andre Marsh, Color Sergeant, 22 years, stood the well-gate for the next 5 hours in his shirt sleeves with another man's rifle, because there was nobody on the gate, and because he had told a soldier there was. They walked Hale up the boulevard to the van. 6,000 people watched a bleeding man in a red tunic, with his hands cuffed behind him, being marched past them by 4 police officers. And one of those officers was me, and I was on his left, with my hand on his upper arm, because that is the drill, and I could feel him shaking. Not fear. I have felt fear in a man's arm. This was something else. It was the shake of an engine that has been run at full power for a very long time and has just been switched off. The crowd was screaming, not at him, at us. There were men leaning over the barrier with their faces purple, and a woman with a small flag was crying and saying, "You should be ashamed. You should be ashamed," over and over directly at me, and I looked at the pavement and I kept walking. And then somebody started clapping. One man, slow, and then the man beside him, and then the whole eastern stretch of that boulevard, 6,000 people, clapping, a slow, hard, deliberate clap, in time, the way you applaud something you want a man to hear, and they were not clapping us, and they were not clapping Crowe. Wystan Hale walked up the middle of that in handcuffs with his head up and his eyes forward, and he did not look at one of them. At the van, before they put him in, he turned his head and spoke to me. It was the only time he ever addressed me directly, in all the months that followed before the courtroom. He said, "Constable, is he still on the gate, the color sergeant?" I looked back down the boulevard. 200 meters of red and shouting, and at the far end of it, a small figure in a white shirt standing perfectly still on a strip of flagstone with a rifle at his boot. "Yes," I said. "Good," said Wystan Hale, and got into the van. The homecoming procession came up the boulevard 9 minutes late. Somebody very senior had made a very fast decision, and the route was not changed, and I have always thought that was correct. 6,000 people had come to see their king, and they were owed their king. I was standing at the cordon by then, on the barrier, with my hands behind my back and my face burning. And the drums came, and the horses, and the 2 files of the king's own household guard in scarlet, and then the state landau. And the king of Aldenmere came past a crowd that did not cheer. That is the thing nobody had planned for. 6,000 people, and they did not cheer him. They were not angry with him. They stood there, holding their flags, absolutely silent, because they did not know what else to do with what they had just seen, and the silence went up that boulevard ahead of the landau like a cold front. I watched King Alaric's face as he passed me at 11 meters. He was 68 years old, and he had been doing that job for 11 years, and he had a face like a well-made door. And I watched him hear the silence, and I watched him turn his head not at the crowd, at the asterisk wall, and look down the length of that wall to the well-gate, where there was a gap in the barriers 11 paces long, with a color sergeant standing in shirt-sleeves in the middle of it, holding a rifle that was not his own. The king of Aldenmere looked at that for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he faced front, and the landau went on up the boulevard, and I stood at my barrier, and I understood, in a way I could not have put into words, that something very large had begun to move. They put him in the cells at Wellgate Station. They did not take him to the palace. They did not hand him to his own chain of command. Sergeant Crowe booked Lance Corporal Wystan Hale into a custody suite as a prisoner, and the custody sergeant on the desk, a decent, frightened man named Pell, looked at the split lip and the split glove and the state of the tunic and said, "What's this?" And Crowe said, "Resisted." And Pell wrote *resisted in the book, because a sergeant said it, and that word cost him his career too in the end. And I have never been able to be angry with him about it, because I know exactly what it feels like to be handed a word by a man you trust. They asked Hale for his details. He gave them. Name: Hale Wystan. Occupation: soldier. Address: he gave the barracks. Do you want a solicitor? I want my chain of command informed. That's not what I asked. It's what I'm answering. And then he said the only other thing he said in that building, and Pell wrote it in the custody record. And 14 months later, a Crown advocate read it out to a hushed court, and a judge asked for it to be read a second time. He said, "I was relieved of my rifle at approximately 10:53. The Wellgate is being held by Color Sergeant Marsh, who is not dressed for it and has been on duty since 05:00. Somebody needs to relieve him. That is all I want. Not a lawyer, not a doctor, not his wife. Somebody needs to relieve him." And so we come back to the pen, and the buff-colored form, and the drop of ink hanging at the nib. "The soldier struck first," Sergeant Crowe said. "You saw it, put it down." The sergeant's room smelled of instant coffee and wet wool. Merrick was at the far desk with his own form in front of him and his ears red. Toole was standing by the window with his back to us, and he had not said one word since the boulevard. "Sergeant," I said, "I didn't see that." "You were 6 meters away with a crowd surging. You saw a red coat come at me." He was very calm. That was the horror of it. He was completely calm. He had his hands on the desk and his voice was reasonable and warm, and he was explaining something to me as a senior officer explains a difficult thing to a probationer. 19 weeks, Ardwick. You don't know what you saw. You know what you felt. You felt frightened and confused, and you're going to sit there and try to build a memory out of that, and you'll build it wrong. That's not a criticism. That's neurology. So I'm going to help you. By telling me what I saw. By telling you what happened. There's a difference and you'll learn it. He straightened up. A crowd control incident got out of hand because a soldier abandoned his post and inflamed a crowd. I used lawful force to restore order. He resisted. That's the incident. Everything else is a phone video with no context. And I promise you, Constable, I have watched 100 careers die of no context . I said there were 120 phones. And Crowe smiled at me, really smiled. A warm one. The barracks laughed just under the surface and said, "There were, and every one of them belongs to a person who's going home tonight. Do you know how many of them will still be angry in a fortnight? None. Do you know who will still be here in a fortnight?" He tapped the desk twice with 2 fingers. "Us." Then he went out and left the form in front of me. I sat there for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I looked at the clock at the start and the end, the way you do when time has gone strange. I would like to tell you that I thought about justice, or about the man in the cells, or about the woman on the boulevard crying "you should be ashamed." I did not. What I actually thought about, sitting there, was my mother, and how she had come to my passing out parade in a coat she could not afford, and how she had held my warrant card in both hands and looked at it for a long moment before she gave it back to me. And then I thought about my notebook. Here is the thing about probationers that Sergeant Delvin Crowe, in 14 years of certainty, had never once had to think about. Every officer in the Aldenmere City Constabulary wore a body-worn camera. Crowe's was on his chest that morning. He switched it off at 10:44. You can see his hand come up and do it, in the footage from a tourist's phone, 7 seconds before he stepped onto the flagstones, and afterwards he reported the device as having failed to record due to a battery fault. There was, indeed, a battery fault logged against that unit 3 weeks earlier by the technical section. It was entirely, beautifully plausible. Merrick's camera was not switched on at all. Merrick had a habit of not switching his on, and that habit was known, and that was how Merrick came to lose his job. Toole's camera recorded 4 minutes, and then he turned to face the crowd, and it recorded 4 minutes of the backs of people's heads. Mine recorded everything. And a probationer's camera, in that constabulary in that year, was not like anybody else's camera. Because a probationer is under continuous assessment, every unit worn by an officer inside their 2-year probation was flagged for automatic evidential upload. Not to the station server, where a supervisor might tidy it, but directly to the Training and Standards Directorate at headquarters, where a tutor assessor reviewed a random sample of your recordings every month and wrote you a report on how you spoke to the public. It went up automatically. It went up encrypted. It went up the moment the unit was docked in any charging cradle anywhere in the force, and it could not be deleted at station level by anybody. Not by a sergeant, not by a chief superintendent, because the entire point of the system was to catch a probationer being lied about or lying. Nobody had told Sergeant Crowe. Why would they? He had been out of probation for 12 years. The rule had come in 8 years earlier in a memo, and he was a man who did not read memos, because memos are for people who need to be told things. My camera was in my hand. I had taken it off in the van, and it sat in my palm in that sergeant's room like a stone out of a riverbed. And I understood, sitting there, that in about 6 hours, when my shift ended and I put it in the rack, a machine in a building on the other side of the city was going to tell the truth whether I did or not. That is not courage. I have never let anybody call it courage. I was a frightened girl who worked out that the lie would not survive, and who then, at last, with the arithmetic done, did the right thing. But I did it. That much is mine. I picked up the pen and I wrote what happened, all of it, 1,100 words in my own hand, beginning at approximately 10:04 hours. I observed Sergeant Crowe direct the removal of 2 barrier sections, and ending at no point did the soldier raise his hands, speak, or leave his post. I signed it. I dated it. I walked it down the corridor myself, and put it into the hands of Inspector Halloway, the duty inspector, who read the first paragraph standing up and then sat down very slowly into a chair. Then I went back to the sergeant's room, and Crowe looked up and looked at my face and knew. For 9 days, they nearly buried it anyway. I want that understood, because there is a comfortable version of this story in which the video came out and justice simply happened, and that version is a lie that lets everybody sleep at night. The video came out on the Friday afternoon. By Friday evening it had been watched 2 million times, and it still very nearly did not matter. Here is how you bury a thing. You do not deny it, you reframe asterisk it. By Saturday morning, the constabulary statement did not say the video was wrong. It said the video was a partial record of a complex public order incident, and that the officer's use of force must be assessed in the context of the full circumstances, including the soldier's decision to leave his post. You do not attack the man. You build a shape around him, left his post, inflamed the crowd, resisted. 3 phrases in 3 statements over 3 days, until they are the water everybody is swimming in. You find the reasonable voices and you let them ask the reasonable question. What were the crowd management protocols? Was the sentry's presence itself a hazard? And it is a reasonable question. That is what makes it lethal. And you do it from a very great height. On the Sunday, Chief Superintendent Corporal Crowe gave an interview in which he did not once mention his son. He spoke about the pressures on frontline officers and about a rush to judgment. He said, and I remember the exact phrasing because it made me put my hand over my mouth, I would counsel the public against reaching a verdict from a shaky telephone. That is what courts are for. He was quite right. That is what courts are for. He simply had no intention of ever letting it reach one. The charges against Wystan Hale, assault on a police officer, obstruction affray, were not dropped. They sat there live for 9 days, and every day they sat there they did their work, because for as long as a soldier stood charged with assaulting a policeman, the story was *a fight, and a fight has 2 sides. Meanwhile, quietly, Constable Toole was moved to another division. 2 officers from the western end of the cordon were interviewed by an old friend of the Crowes and produced statements of extraordinary vagueness. A request went to the coach company for the contact details of its passengers. And on the Monday, 4 constables walked the boulevard identifying witnesses, and at least 11 members of the public were asked, in that gentle, unrefusable way, whether they might not prefer to delete a video that could prejudice a live investigation. 9 of them did. And I was called in to see a superintendent I had never met, who was kind to me for 25 minutes, and who explained that my statement showed excellent instincts, but that a probationer's perception under stress was a well-documented weak point in evidence, and that nobody would think any the less of me if, on reflection, I found there were details I was no longer certain of. I sat in that office with my hands flat on my knees, and I said, "Sir, is my body-worn footage at training and standards?" And I watched a superintendent of the Aldenmere City Constabulary go the color of the wall behind him. That was the 9th day. On the 10th day, the Crown Prince came to Wellgate Station. He did not come with a motorcade. He came in a plain car with 2 protection officers, and he walked in through the public door of a police station like a man reporting a stolen bicycle. And the effect was seismic, because the entire building, which had spent 9 days constructing a very careful shape, had roughly 40 seconds notice. Crown Prince Rowan was 34. He was colonel of the 2nd Regiment of Foot. He had done 8 years regular service, and he had that quality some men have of occupying more room than his body did. He asked to see Lance Corporal Hale. He was told, by a divisional commander who had come down 3 flights of stairs at a run, that Lance Corporal Hale was on bail and not in the building. He asked to see the custody record. He was shown it. He read the line, "Somebody needs to relieve him," and stood in the middle of a police custody suite holding a hardbound book, saying nothing at all, for about 10 seconds. Every officer in that room found something else to look at. Then he said, "Where is he?" They met in the yard behind the barracks. I was not there. Everything I am about to set down I have from Color Sergeant Marsh, who was, and who told it to me 9 years later across a table with a pot of tea between us, and who was not a man who embroidered anything. Hale was on light duties, because his left leg had swollen so badly he could not march, and light duties in the household guard means you clean things. He was cleaning a rifle when the Crown Prince walked into the yard. He stood up and came to attention. Rowan told him to sit down. He did not sit down. Rowan said, "The charges against you are a disgrace and they end today. My father's household has taken advice. Representations will be made to the Director of Public Prosecutions this afternoon. You will be released, cleared, and the man who did this will be dealt with. You have my word." And Wystan Hale said, "Sir, respectfully, no." Marsh told me the Crown Prince of Aldenmere looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Say that again." "I don't want the charges lifted, sir. I want them tried." "Corporal." "Sir, if I walk out of this because a prince made a telephone call, then in 6 months there will be 100,000 people in this kingdom who believe I struck a policeman and got away with it because I wear the king's coat." He was still at attention. Marsh said he never came off it, not once, the whole time. "He called me decoration, sir. He called me a hat. If the crown reaches down and lifts me out of a courtroom because of who I stand in front of, then he was right. Then I am a hat. Everything that happened on that street stops meaning anything, and every man on that wall becomes a joke for the next 100 years. You could go to prison." "Yes, sir." "For something you did not do." "Yes, sir." "And if I do, it will be because 12 ordinary people of this kingdom looked at what happened on that street and got it wrong. I would rather live in a country where that can happen to me than in one where it can't." There was a long silence in that yard. Marsh said he could hear a pigeon. Then Rowan said, "And if I overrule you, I am the heir to this throne. I could have those charges gone by 4 o'clock and you could not stop me." And Hale said, "No, sir, I couldn't. But you would think less of me." And Wystan Hale, 29 years old, a lance corporal with a swollen leg and a split lip, at attention in a barracks yard in front of the future king, said, "It isn't my place to think anything of you, sir." Marsh said the Crown Prince laughed. One short, disbelieving bark of a laugh in an empty yard. Then he stopped laughing and stood there a while and finally said, "Very well, the Crown will make no representations, the Crown will do nothing at all." He turned to go and stopped. "Except one thing, my aunt is your colonel-in-chief. She will be in that courtroom every day in the public gallery in a plain coat as a private person, and she will not say one word. That is not interference, Corporal. That is attendance asterisk. And I would advise you not to argue with her about it, because I have tried it for 34 years, and it has never once worked." And so the trap closed, and it was Wystan Hale who had closed it on himself, and for 11 weeks it looked very much as though it was going to eat him. I will not dwell on the 11 weeks. They were mostly paper, and paper is slow. But some of it must be said, because people imagine that the truth arrives like weather. It does not. It arrives like a man carrying boxes up a staircase, one at a time, while other men stand at the top and tell him the staircase is closed. A tutor assessor at the Training and Standards Directorate, a civilian named Osric Pell, sat down on the Tuesday to review his monthly random sample and found in it 11 minutes and 40 seconds of body-worn footage from probationer Constable N. Ardwick, warrant number 4471, timestamped the 11th. He watched it twice. Then he did the bravest thing anybody did in that whole affair, and I include everybody, and I include myself. He did not send it up his chain of command. He knew whose son it was. He put it on a secure disk, signed an evidential continuity form, took a day of his own leave, drove it himself to the office of the Independent Police Complaints Commissioner, put it into the hands of a lawyer at the counter, and got a receipt. He was 56, on a middling salary, with a daughter at university, and if the Crowes had one, he would have been finished inside a week. They gave him no medal. There is no medal for what he did. There ought to be. Once the disc was outside the building, the shape came apart, because a shape is only a shape while everybody agrees to look at it from the same angle. The investigators pulled the tourist footage, the coach company's dashboard camera, and the 2 palace wall cameras, which had recorded the whole of the flagstones from above, in color, for the entire 71 seconds, automatically, and which belonged to nobody in the constabulary at all. That was the detail that killed every argument about what a body-worn camera might have missed. The charges against Wystan Hale were discontinued on the 22nd day. There was no apology. There is never an apology. There is a letter, and the letter says the Crown offers no evidence, and the letter arrives second class. Sergeant Delvin Crowe was suspended on the 23rd day and charged on the 51st with 9 counts of assault, 1 count of misconduct in public office, and this was the one that mattered. This was the one that made it more than a bad temper on a bright morning. 1 count of perverting the course of justice, in that he did unlawfully procure and attempt to procure false statements from officers under his command. Chief Superintendent Oral Crowe was interviewed under caution on the 58th day. He said nothing at all for 9 hours, which was his absolute right, and which he had spent 30 years advising suspects not to do. And I was a leper. I do not say that for sympathy. I say it because every young officer who hears this story should know the shape of it, so that if it ever comes for them they will recognize it and not think they are going mad. Nobody shouted at me. Nobody threatened me. Nobody left anything on my locker. It was so much better done than that. I simply stopped being spoken to. My tutor constable was reassigned for operational reasons. My shifts were rearranged so that I worked alone. In the parade room a conversation would be happening, and I would join the edge of it, and it would finish courteously, with everybody nodding and drifting away. For 14 weeks I ate my lunch standing up in a corridor. My mother asked me why I was so thin. I told her the food was bad. And once on a night shift in the 3rd month, an old constable about to retire walked past me in the yard and said, without stopping and without turning his head, "You did right, girl." 6 words. I sat in a police car for 10 minutes afterwards with my hands over my face. The trial of Delvin Crowe opened on a Tuesday in February at the Great Assize in Aldenmere, before Lord Justice Marrow. 2,000 people stood in the street outside in the sleet at 8 in the morning, in silence, not chanting, not marching, just standing there in coats. For a lance corporal none of them had ever met. And in the third row of the public gallery, in a gray wool coat and a plain scarf, having queued at the door with everybody else, and having declined the seat the usher tried 3 times to offer her, sat Princess Adela, Colonel-in-Chief of the King's own household guard, 61 years old, her hands folded in her lap. She came every day, 9 days. She did not speak to the press, she did not speak in court, she did not miss a session. On the third morning, a journalist asked her on the steps whether her presence was appropriate. She said, "I am the colonel-in-chief of his regiment. He is on trial for nothing. I am on nobody's side but the truth's, and if the truth is against him, I shall sit here and hear that too." And then she went inside and sat down, and did not say another word for 6 days. The Crown was led by an advocate named Perrin Locke, 50, gray, so quiet in his manner that for the first hour you wondered whether he was any good, and by the second hour you had stopped wondering. He opened without a single adjective. Members of the jury. On the morning in question, a man stood on 11 paces of stone because he had been ordered to stand there. Another man, who had no authority over him whatsoever, hit him 9 times with a baton in front of 6,000 people. You will hear a great deal in this trial about crowd management and about protocols and about the pressures of policing, and none of it, none asterisk of it, will alter those 2 sentences. The defense will invite you to look for a fight. You will find that there was no fight. There was only a beating and a man who would not move. And then he played the footage. They played it 4 times over the 9 days, and I watched it 4 times, and I have never watched it since. The first time they played the tourist phone, the shaky one, the one the whole kingdom had seen, with the sound of the crowd on it and a woman's voice saying, "Oh, oh, oh," like something being torn. The second time they played the palace wall camera from above, clean and silent and steady, and it was infinitely worse. There is no sound on it at all. You watch a small red figure and a small dark figure on a strip of pale stone, and the dark figure moves and the red figure does not, and the dark figure moves again and the red figure does not, and it goes on in silence from 40 feet up, for 71 seconds, and a woman on the jury put her hand up and asked the judge, in a perfectly steady voice, whether she might be excused for a moment, and went out and came back with her chin up. The third time, Locke played it with a clock on the screen and a counter, and he took the jury through it blow by blow, and after each one he said the same 6 words in the same flat voice, without any performance at all. Note what the soldier does not do. He said it 9 times. And the 4th time, this was the last day of the prosecution case, and I think it was the most ruthless thing I have ever seen done in a courtroom. Locke played 30 seconds of it with the sound up, and asked the jury to listen not to the crowd but to a single sound underneath it, and he had the technicians isolate it. It was the sound of Wystan Hale's boots, not moving, the tiny scuff and settle of a man's soles finding the same square of stone again after each impact. "That," said Perrin Locke, "is the sound of a soldier being hit in the face and choosing to stay where he was put. The defendant heard it 9 times, and he did not stop. I gave evidence on the 4th day. I was 24 by then. I wore my uniform because I was ordered to, and I have never been so aware of a collar in my life. The oath is short. The witness box at the Great Assize is a wooden pen you stand up in, and you can see the whole court from it, and you can see the dock. Delvin Crowe looked at me the entire time I was in that box. He never once looked away. It was not a glare. It was much worse. It was the patient, warm, wounded look of a man watching a girl he had been kind to do something she was going to regret. Locke took me through it in 25 minutes. The barriers at 10:04. the refusal of my radio request, the line in the muster room, then he'll learn what a real uniform can do, the 71 seconds, the walk to the van. Then he asked me, Constable Ardwick, on the afternoon of the 11th, in the sergeant's room at Wellgate Station, did the defendant ask you to write something in a witness statement that was not true? He did. What did he ask you to write? That the soldier struck first. And did the soldier strike first? No, sir. Did the soldier strike at all? And I said, no, sir, the soldier never moved. And the defense Dowd, the soft, clever man, got up and did what he had to do, and he did it for 2 hours, and he was not cruel, which somehow made it harder. He asked me why I had not intervened. He asked me why I had let a man be beaten 6 meters from where I stood. He asked me whether the true reason I had turned on my sergeant was to save my own career. And I stood in that box and I said, Sir, I have asked myself all 3 of those questions every night for 19 weeks, and my answers are cowardice, cowardice, and I don't know, but none of that changes what is on the recording. I was a coward and he was a criminal, and only one of those is on trial. Lord Justice Marrow looked up from his notes at that. He looked at me for about 2 seconds over his glasses. He did not say anything. But he wrote something down, and afterwards in his sentencing remarks, he used one word about my evidence, and the word was unsparing, and I have kept that word in a drawer of my head for 19 years and taken it out when I needed it. Wystan Hale gave evidence on the 6th day. He came in uniform without the bearskin, carrying it under his left arm, and the entire court stood up. Not by arrangement, not because anybody said to. The jury stood, and the press benches stood, and the public gallery stood, and Lord Justice Marrow allowed it for perhaps 4 seconds and then said, dryly, This court will sit, and everybody sat down, embarrassed and moved, and in the dock Delvin Crowe watched a room full of strangers get to their feet for a man he had called a hat. Hale gave his evidence in flat, short sentences. He answered every question with the fewest words that would carry it. He agreed that he had left his post to lift an elderly lady off the flagstones. He described it as a breach of his standing orders and said he would do it again and would expect to be disciplined for it. And Locke asked whether he had been, and he said, Yes, sir. Extra duties. 7 days. The court made a noise at that. Marrow led it. And then Dowd stood up and asked the only question he had. Lance Corporal Hale, you are a trained soldier. Yes, sir. You are trained in unarmed combat. Yes, sir. You are 29 years old and in excellent physical condition, and my client is 41 and is not. You were holding a rifle. It was at the order, sir. Grounded. You could have stopped him. At any point in those 71 seconds, you could have put my client on the ground. Could you not? And Wystan Hale said, Yes, sir. Then why in God's name didn't you? And the great assize of Aldenmere went so quiet that I could hear the radiator. Hale looked at him. He did not look at the jury. Men like him never play to a jury, which is exactly why juries believe them. He looked at the man who had asked him the question, and he said, Because the moment I put my hands on him, sir, the post was empty. Dowd waited. He was too good a lawyer not to know that the answer was not finished, and too good a man not to let it come. There are 11 paces of stone at the Wellgate, Hale said, and 1 man on them at a time. That is all. There is a steel gate behind and a wall on either side, and Sergeant Crowe was right that the stone does not stop anybody. It is not meant to. It is a promise. It says, whatever happens out here, that gate is held, and it is held by somebody who will not leave. If I had hit him, I would have won. I am quite sure of that. And then I would have been a soldier fighting a policeman in the street in front of 6,000 people, and every single person on that boulevard would have gone home believing that the man on the wall is just another man with a temper who will move if you push him hard enough. So there was nothing to decide, sir. He could have gone on all morning. I was not standing there for him. He paused once, and that was the only pause in the whole of his evidence. I was standing there for the next man who stands there. Dowd said, "No further questions," and sat down, and I saw his hand shake very slightly as he did it. And in the dock, Delvin Crowe put his face in his hands. The jury were out for 4 hours and 11 minutes, and they came back guilty on every count. 9 counts of assault, 1 of misconduct in a public office, and unanimously perverting the course of justice, because on the 7th day Constable Merrick had walked into the witness box, looked at the floor, and told the truth about the sergeant's room, and Constable Toole had done the same the following morning, and neither of them had needed to be pushed, and both of them, I think, had been waiting a year for somebody to ask. Lord Justice Marrow sentenced him 3 weeks later. He said a number of things that were reported everywhere, and one thing that was not, and it is the one thing I remember. He said, "You have argued through your counsel that you did not know what he would do. That is untrue in the only sense that matters. You knew precisely what he would do. That is why you did it. A man who believes he may be struck back does not raise a baton 9 times in front of 120 cameras. You beat him because he was safe to beat. That is not a loss of temper, Mr. Crowe. That is a calculation, and it is the calculation of a coward, and it is the reason this court will not treat you as a good man who had a bad morning. 5 years, dismissed from the service, barred for life from any office of the Crown." And then Marrow did something that is not in the ordinary run of things, and asked whether the complainant wished to address the court. I did not think he would. I thought he would say no and stand there and let it end. Wystan Hale rose from the bench at the back, in his red tunic, with the bearskin under his arm, and Delvin Crowe stood up in the dock and looked at him. And for the first and only time in the whole of that year, the two of them looked at each other. And Hale said, "Only this, my lord. He asked me a question on that street and I wasn't allowed to answer it, so I'll answer it now." He turned his head very slightly toward the dock. "You asked me what I was for. I'm for standing still while other men decide what kind of country this is. That morning you decided. I'd have stood there all day." Then he sat down. Chief Superintendent Oral Crowe was convicted 8 months later, in a smaller courtroom with far fewer people in the street, of conspiring to pervert the course of justice. The deleted videos, the vague statements, the friendly interviews. 2 years. He resigned 4 days before he was charged, and the letter he wrote to his officers on leaving was long and dignified and full of the word service, and I have never met anybody who read past the first paragraph. The superintendent who had been kind to me for 25 minutes took early retirement. Merrick was dismissed over the camera. Toole resigned before they could decide about him, and I met him once, years later, at a petrol station, and neither of us could think of a single thing to say. Custody Sergeant Pell, the one who wrote *, resisted because a sergeant told him to, was reduced in rank and kept his job. He worked another 9 years, and he was, by every account I ever heard, meticulous to the point of madness about the accuracy of a custody record. I have thought a great deal about why. And the King's Bench Commission on Public Order, which King Alaric established by warrant on the 12th day of the following month, reported 18 months later and produced, among a great many dull and necessary things, 1 line of statute that is still on the books of the Kingdom of Aldenmere, that no barrier or cordon under police control may be positioned so as to obstruct or expose a sentry's beat, and that the command of the ground around a crown post belongs to the crown post. 11 paces of stone got their own law. Wystan Hale never mentioned it once in the whole of his life. He went back to the Wellgate on a Thursday in March, at 10:02 in the morning, 16 months after they had led him up the boulevard in handcuffs. Nobody announced it. There was no ceremony. There was a whisper somewhere, and by 9 o'clock the pavement opposite the palace wall was full, and by 10 it was a crowd, 300 or 400 people standing on a wet street on a Thursday, not shouting, not filming well, some of them filming, mostly just standing. He came out of the dark of the arch into the light, and marched to the center of his flagstones, and halted, and came to the order. And the crowd did not cheer, not one of them. I think they had learned something. They stood there in the rain and looked at him, and an old man near me in a shabby regimental blazer took his cap off, and after a moment 2 or 3 others took theirs off, and it went along that pavement like a wave going out. 400 bare heads on a Thursday morning, in silence, in front of a man who did not look at any of them. Then he shouldered arms and stepped off, and marched his 11 paces east. I was there, out of uniform, in a coat at the back. I stayed about an hour. When I turned to go, there was a woman standing at my shoulder in a gray wool coat and a plain scarf, 62 years old, entirely unaccompanied, who had clearly been there some while. Princess Adela looked at the wall, not at me. "You are the constable," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You were 19 weeks in." "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My regiment will never thank you. You should know that now, and you should not resent it. They will be perfectly civil, and they will never once thank you, because to thank you they would have to say out loud what one of your people did to one of theirs, and they would rather stand in the rain for 100 years. She turned her head and looked at me properly for the first time. "So I shall do it instead. Thank you." And she put her hands back in her pockets and walked off down the wet street on her own, and 100 people who would have queued for a photograph of her did not recognize her at all. I did not leave the constabulary. I have been asked why, more times than I can count, sometimes angrily, usually by people who have never had to decide anything. I stayed because Wystan Hale had told a courtroom that he stood on that stone for the next man who stands there. I have never had 11 paces. What I had was a warrant card, and a great many people in this city who had stopped believing there was any point in it, and it seemed to me that walking away would be a way of agreeing with them. I am an inspector now. I have been for 6 years. Every intake of probationers that comes through my station on their first Monday, I walk out of the building with them and up the boulevard to the eastern end of the palace wall, and I stand them on the pavement opposite the Wellgate Arch, and I make them watch a sentry for 10 minutes. Just watch him. No talking. Then I tell them the story. All of it, including the 11 minutes I sat with a pen in my hand, and including the fact that I only did the right thing after I had worked out that the wrong one would not survive. They always ask the same question at the end. They always ask what happened to him. He is a color sergeant now. He served 22 years and he trains the new intakes at the barracks up the hill, and he is said to be very hard and completely fair, and he has a wife called Marin and a house with a difficult garden. He has never given an interview. He turned down a great deal of money to write a book. When the kingdom wanted to give him a medal, he wrote back and said, with what I am told was genuine bewilderment, that he had not done anything. He had simply been on duty. And once, only once, a letter came for him at the barracks, 4 years after the trial, in a handwriting the post room recognized, and it was from a man who had by then been released and who was living in a small town and working in a builder's yard. Color Sergeant Marsh told me that Hale read it and thought about it for 2 days, and then wrote 3 lines back and posted it himself. I asked Marsh what the 3 lines said. He said Hale had never told him, and he had never asked, and that anybody who thought a household guardsman would tell you a thing like that had not understood one single word of the story. That is the whole of it. A police officer attacked a soldier in public, and the soldier did not move, and everybody expected the ending to be the beating. It was not. The ending was 71 seconds of a man refusing to make it a fight, and then, because he refused, a courtroom, a jury, a judge, a law, and a country that had to look at itself. People still say to me that he won because he was strong. They have it backwards. He won because he stayed still, and staying still was the hardest thing anybody did on that street. Everyone else moved. Crowe moved. The crowd moved. I moved 6 meters back into a lie I very nearly signed. One man stood, and the whole of it turned around him like a door on a hinge. If you go up the boulevard on a Thursday morning, he is not there anymore. It will be a lad of 22 with a smashed flat nose or a girl from the northern counties, and they will march their 11 paces and turn about and come back and stand. Stop, watch them for a minute. That is all anybody is asking. They are not decoration. They are a promise kept out loud in the rain by somebody who will not leave.